Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Kristina Lunz, who is the co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, which she co-founded in 2018. She has a long resume, so I am just going to pick out a few interesting things of note. She has worked for the UNDP. She's worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has been named 30 Under 30, 100 Women of the Year in 2020 by various organizations. She's also worked as an external foreign advisor to the German Foreign Ministry. And to that illustrious resume, she's now adding author, and she's the author of this book, which we're here to talk about. The future of foreign policy is feminist. Kristina also spent some time at the Blavatnik School, which I think 7 years ago, is that right?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Which is why we're very, very lucky to have her with us today. I will structure the conversation between the two of us. I'm going to ask a few questions of Kristina, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So be thinking about what you would like to ask Kristina. So, Kristina, I'm going to start by asking you about the story you tell at the start of the book. That was your introduction to politics, which you didn't really perhaps intend to be an introduction to politics, but you published a petition in a very well-known German tabloid or magazine, I would say tabloid, Bild. And can you just tell us a little bit about that petition and why it was such a formative moment, why it led in many ways to the project you're now engaged in?
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, BSG and Daisy, for having me. I'm so excited to be here and loving that first question because it's closely tied to my time here at Oxford. Because I did my master's here in global governance and diplomacy, 2014, 2015. And when I came here, the first week, I think, it started the summer before that, but the first week I was mainly busy with setting up this petition. And a lot of my time here at Oxford, whilst I guess I should have studied more, I spent doing this petition, giving interviews, managing a team, forming alliances. It was this interesting competition between books and the petition. And it was the first time that I was publicly active as a feminist, I guess. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the story was that there's this newspaper in Germany called Bild newspaper, as you rightly said. It's extremely sexist and racist and many things. And Bild, the summer before I came here, so I did a first master's in London, then came here, and the summer in between, I was back home in the village, the countryside, and at the gas station, when I was about to pay, I saw the front page of the newspaper, and it asked its readers to rate Germany's most beautiful cleavage, and only with pictures only of the cleavages of really famous and accomplished women. And I got so furious. Having studied in London about human rights, for me, for the first time, I did psychology in my bachelor's. So learning about human rights and global policy and the connections between biases and dehumanization and increased levels of violence and all of this. And then seeing this newspaper, I was so furious. And out of this anger, I wrote this first an open letter, which then became a petition. Once change.org contacted me. And it was hugely inspired also by at that time, well-known campaign here in the UK called No More Page 3. So this campaign really took off, also because the then editor-in-chief, he thought it's appropriate to make fun of me, humiliate me on Twitter in front of his tens of thousands of followers. So with that, it was for me also the first experience with massive amounts of online violence and rape threats and threats against my family. And all of that our patriarchal society and disproportionately men do to silence women. So this experience of trying to do something which I was so convinced would be the right thing, kind of asking for respectful portrayal of women in a newspaper. It's really not rocket science. And then experiencing the massive backlash and understanding then how it is this, it's patriarchal society's attempt to keep the patriarchal status quo. That, I guess, one thing led to another, and I, from then on, was involved in other feminist campaigns, started working internationally, and then was not too happy either, I guess, about some of the dynamics that I found.
Yeah. So you talk about in the book, and you've just mentioned now, about some of the online hate that was directed at you as a result of this petition. And we have a project here at the Blavatnik School that's funded by both Hate Aid and the Alfred Landecker Foundation that looks at patterns of systemic violence against women and who are in public life. And that was your foray, as it were, into public life, and you experienced this. And there are some really incredible statistics. And even in Sweden, we were talking earlier about Sweden, which is often mentioned as a kind of paragon of feminist forward policies. There have been a few studies which have looked at the patterns of online trolling and show really systematically different patterns for female politicians than for male politicians. And I think it's really around that idea that you talk about the need for a feminist foreign policy. And you spend some time in the book talking about why is the word feminist the right word. So I just want to give you the opportunity to explain to everybody why is the word feminist and not, for example, humanist, the right word for why we should be thinking about foreign policy through that framework.
First of all, I want to say how happy it made me when I learned that Blavatnik is doing this collaboration with Hate Aid, this German organization, Germany-based, and a German organization, and it's really kind of unprecedented. It's the first organization that directly supports those who are affected by online violence, and at the same time does policy work in Germany, in Brussels, to really change laws to better protect those the victims of online violence. It's a fantastic organization. The founder, Annalena, and I were great friends, and also just sit together and chat about what it's like building an organization. So I'm really, really pleased to know that. The word feminist, why feminist? Feminist foreign policy as kind of the attempt and the demand to use all diplomatic tools in a way that injustices globally are being reduced is nothing new. It still seems new, and it's still kind of a little bit of a niche-y topic, whilst we already have 16 states out there that officially have announced a feminist foreign policy. The history when it comes to state level is fairly new. It was only in 2014 that Sweden announced a feminist foreign policy under then Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, and Sweden was the first country to do so. So that was 2014. And that was really important to me in the book. I have a whole chapter on the history of feminist foreign policy, making the point that it did not start in 2014. Yeah. Also, we, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, didn't invent it. And whilst it is the first book on the topic, those practicing and developing and demanding it, that goes back at least to 1915, maybe younger, but history on women is another problem in itself in patriarchal societies. We just don't know as much about women in history. But at least in 1915, so what happened in 1915 is that during the First World War in The Hague, more than 1,000 feminists came together, not only to demand an end to the First World War, but also they published 20 resolutions for a new global order, which they argued would finally give us the chance to build sustainably safe and secure and peaceful societies. So these demands included mediation as the first or the key tool to mitigate out of conflicts for conflict resolution. It also included the demand for a court of arbitration for international disputes. It included an organization that would govern economic disputes internationally. It included the dismantling of the military-industrial complex and much more. Back then, all hugely ahead of its time and visionary, but over the decades, most of these demands, except for the disarmament and dismantling of the military-industrial complex, were put into reality with the League of Nations and then the United Nations, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the World Trade Organization and so forth. So the feminists, the women back then who knew each other through the suffragette movement, when they did their work, it was feminist work. They called it feminist work, they were feminists, and over the decades, the work, be it around in the 70s and 75, the decade of women at the UN, and the big international conferences in Nairobi and Copenhagen and Mexico City, and the adoption of the 1979 Convention on all forms of, give me a second, Convention on the Eradication of All Forms of Violence Against Women. And all of that has been in this feminist tradition, including the 2000 Women, Peace and Security Agenda and Resolution 1325 at the Security Council. So the work now that we're doing, that I'm doing with the book, and that my center, the organization, is doing in the States, who are doing all that in tradition and based on what others did before them and standing on their shoulders, I would find it ungrateful in a way if we did not call what those, if we didn't call it what those called it that came before us. First, because of that, because it's a clear feminist tradition, clearly based on the feminist movement, and adding to that, if we called it humanist, I think we humanism as the historical concept and movement did not care about gender equality. It did not care about freedom for women or for racialized people and so forth. So it would just really not work.
Wouldn't feel right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what a feminist foreign policy actually means in practice, right? So again, let's come back to Sweden, the third time it's mentioned. So you mentioned that Sweden was among the first countries to adopt actually feminist foreign policy in practice. And you talk about the 3 R's, right? Rights, resources, and representation. So can you just tell us a little bit about, like, what does this look like in practice? Right? So we know the history, you've alluded a little bit to how many of the things that were thought of as pie in the sky ideas at the time of World War I have actually been realized. So this isn't about, a kind of castles in the sky without the ability to build firm foundations and anything. But so can you walk us through, what does that actually mean? What do the 3 R's mean? And how has it actually been practiced in the case of Sweden?
Again, I'll go a little step back before responding to exactly that. So with Sweden being the first country who institutionalized feminist foreign policy on a state level, you're absolutely right. They used the framework of 3 R's. Sometimes they say it's 4 R's, so it's rights, human rights for everyone, so a lot of catching up for women's rights, representation, fair representation of all groups of society, and investing resources into achieving human rights for all and justice. And a fourth R, reality, the reality check, to make sure it's based on facts and research. So going one step back, feminist foreign policy, and so there's also a chapter in the book, and it looks at the theoretical underpinnings of international relations theory and narrative building and forming in society, understanding that the narratives that we tell each other have the power to influence people's behavior and have the power to form institutions. So if we, for example, believe that nuclear weapons and being able to deter others with nuclear weapons keeps everyone safe, then we would put nuclear weapons at the center of some institutions. So NATO, for example, has a strong nuclear doctrine. So just to say that the stories that we tell each other will lead to behavior and institutions. So feminist academics from the 1980s, roughly, 1988, we had a really famous essay by J.N. Turner, and it was on Morgenthau's realism. Mm-hmm. So Morgenthau, one of the famous fathers of so-called realism, was really torn apart by feminist academics back then, and over the time it was argued that the idea of realism in international relations theory really does not properly work for all in society. It's this understanding that because all states, because we do not have a supranational government, all states are in anarchy towards each other. And in order to survive and be powerful in anarchy, states need more weapons and more militarized security, and this kind of thinking then justified imperialism and colonialism, and the oppression and subjugation of other people and nations and so forth. And these feminists said, give me a second, that really is not helpful to explain so much in society. It is not helpful to explain the need for human rights. It's not helpful to explain care activities. It's just, it does not reflect the reality of most people in society. And based on this thinking, then certain international tools were developed. And when Sweden in 2014 announced its feminist foreign policy, they needed, like all states, something really kind of, what's the word? Something
tangible.
Tangible, thank you. Something tangible, which they can use as a framework for their handbooks. So they use the 3 Rs. Mm-hmm. And what they did, and others have followed them, is in Germany, for example, with their guidelines on feminist foreign policy, they're saying, okay, from now on, we're investing up to 95% of our international project funds on projects that at least include gender equality somehow. For example, it includes restructuring foreign ministries to ensure that women, racialized people, LGBTQI community is fairly represented. It includes efforts towards more gender-specific humanitarian assistance. It includes, and the UK has done that recently, despite them not having officially announced a feminist foreign policy, a focus on more funds for women's rights organization and feminist civil society, because we know also from research that these are some of the most powerful actors when it comes to societal change within societies. Mm-hmm. So along this representation, rights and resources, it was Sweden's and other countries' attempt to operationalize kind of this academic and activist mm-hmm. demands and thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this interesting kind of causal story you tell about the stories you tell yourself about how the world works actually influences how the world works, right? So the causality goes from ideas, and there's this really interesting research that that's recently been published about what happens in economics departments in universities. And one of the things that they show is that there's less contribution to public goods in economics departments. Now, why is that? Is that because people who think in kind of, very marginal cost and marginal benefit terms are attracted to that? Or is it because the culture produces its own reality? So it's very much, I think there's a lot to be said that the ideas themselves are creating a certain kind of reality. But let me just ask you one more question, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. You spend some time in the book towards the end talking about the fall of, or the Taliban's retaking of Afghanistan in 2021. And the way that the decisions were made around the key political decisions and many of the accords that governed how essentially Afghanistan would be handed back over, took place without women at the table, and it wasn't a feminist foreign policy. So can you just talk to us a little bit about what should have happened differently if you had been advising the U.S. government or the Biden administration, right? Or as they were thinking about this, what would you have told them to do differently?
What I would have done is bring together, and that is actually a project we're currently doing at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. We have, for the past year or a bit more, we've been working with a steering committee of Afghan women human rights defenders, that with whom and for whom. So we did the fundraising, we got the money, we're paying them to do the work there. They are working with us in conferences and roundtables with kind of the people responsible at the EU or at the UN, responsible for Afghanistan. Or next week they're going to meet our German development minister again for the second time. She's meeting with our steering committee, and we're bringing them together so that the experts can advise the governments how they should act towards the Taliban. Because I would know, I mean, I have an idea, but also how we work is really kind of putting feminist principles into processes. Mm-hmm. So this idea that a feminist foreign policy should first and foremost be informed by those who are affected, ideally by women human rights defenders, civil society. So that is what I would have done. I would have called them to bring them together with the administrations or governments. And the point that I'm making in the book, which in the subchapter here was also written in support with some of these women, is that, so I personally remember when we just started, my co-founder and I, with the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy in Berlin, a year later or so, I was at an event at at an embassy in Berlin, and there was an event on Afghanistan, and there was one diplomat, high-ranking diplomat of another NATO country, and he said on the panel that as they are negotiating with the Taliban, certain compromises have to be made, because otherwise they would not reach a deal in Doha. And he literally said on the panel that women's rights would be one such compromise. So back then I couldn't believe my ears, but and still today it shocks me that people, diplomats, anyone believes that handing away the freedom and the rights of half of society is a fair option how to deal with a country context is just mind-blowing to me. So back then, during the Doha talks, be it kind of the US Afghan negotiations or the inter-Afghan negotiations, there were barely any women involved. There were some involved at some point, but that again, those four, I think, did not represent a bigger fraction of society. So women and women's rights organizations back then were really loud and vocal about, we want to be included, we want to bring our perspectives in, but they weren't let in. And even those governants who on the sidelines helped with the negotiation or were involved with the negotiations in Doha, they also did not make any effort of helping the women in. So when on mid-August 2021, when Kabul fell to the Taliban, that day, what we saw as we and many other human rights, women's rights organizations tried as much as they can to lobby our governments to understand the urgency for especially women and women human rights defenders, there was this media interest all over a sudden about women, what's happening to women in the country. So, for example, one of our advisory council members, Sana Mandalini, back then, 2 years ago, she tweeted, guys, a few years ago, we urged you to focus on the situation of women and get the women in, and now you're all asking where are the women and what can you do to help? You should have done that 2 years ago, but there was no understanding or interest in including them in the perspectives.
So there was no representation at the
Not
table,
at all, yeah.
Right? Which is, yeah. Let's turn to your questions. Yes. Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hi, I'm Isabel. I do a master's here, and I'm also from Germany. And my question is also related to that. So I think you said 16 countries have a feminist foreign policy now. I was wondering, from my perspective, those are very broad definitions. So, for example, I think France has a rather limited understanding of what it means to have feminist foreign policy. So how can we rate them, and how do you see the new German guidelines as to how comprehensive they are?
Yeah, cool. Fantastic question. So those 16 countries, they're really diverse when it comes to their feminist foreign policy. And for some of them, no, I guess, so living in the patriarchal world that we're in, no country in the world will ever have a truly feminist foreign policy, right? And nothing in this patriarchal world, unless we really manage to have a feminist revolution that affects all aspects of life, barely anything will really be properly feminist, definitely not on a state level. Because the patriarchal tradition and history, I mean, patriarchal societies, they've been around for 4,000 to 6,000 years. And then roughly 250 years, we've had the feminist movement trying to fight these patriarchal structures. So those governments who are then trying to make the effort to change at least a little bit their foreign policy making and who call it feminist foreign policy, I find fantastic most of the time. I also have quite some critique in here. But it's an important step to hopefully in I don't know how many years and how many generations to get to a point where foreign policy making really focuses on human rights and human security and justice for all. But we're really far away from that. So all those countries that currently have a feminist foreign policy, I think someone smart once said that in politics it's not about good or bad, but bad or less bad, or something like that. So and I think it applies also to feminist foreign policy. There are some countries where I'm looking at them like, that you cannot have nuclear weapons and at the same time say you have a feminist foreign policy when violence and when nuclear weapons are really kind of the worst form of patriarchal violence, like weapons of mass destruction, right? So that would be, for example, France. And France, it is really laudable that they have done some initiatives. They've really invested a lot more money into international cooperation. And most of their feminist foreign policy actually focuses on international cooperation. They're not touching disarmament at all. So that's a problem. And at the same time, like living with these ambiguities, it's great that they have changed at least something. Then there's Argentina and Mexico and Colombia and especially Latin American countries. I mean, they have a lot. The Latin American continent, they have a really rich feminist history, and quite a bit of it has made it into at least the feminist foreign policy on paper. Then there's again a difference to what they actually do. But if you look at the guidelines and concepts of feminist foreign policy, for example, in Mexico, it's really good. Like it bases their feminist foreign policies in indigenous knowledge and intersectional feminism, and also touches disarmament and LGBTQI rights. So some countries really have put a lot of thinking into this. Also, Germany, I think the guidelines, they're fairly good considering the kind of the dominance and of tradition of like patriarchal tradition. Germany, for example, promised to invest more money into projects with a gender focus. They're not putting more money towards women's rights organizations. That's a problem. But Germany, for example, next week is the second conference of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in New York. Germany is an observer as a NATO country. That is quite something for the second time. And we've done some advocacy work on that. Others have done so. And that is great. So with many countries, you have a couple of great things, a couple of things that are not as good. And with regards to kind of rating, there's no perfect rating or standard. But there's some attempts out there. And I would recommend the Feminist Foreign Policy Index by the ICRW. That's the International Center for Research on Women. ICRW, Feminist Foreign Policy Index. And they have attempted exactly that. They have looked at different international treaties, who's implementing those, what's the representation like, what's the money like, what is legislation like. They've done a good start at that. Great.
Thank you very much. My name is Emma. I'm from the Blavatnik Setting MPP program here. Thank you for the presentation. Maybe my question is a little bit back to the basics. I'm really happy that we are in an environment where we can talk about feminism, patriarchy, and we all know what we mean, kind of. But some of us are coming from countries where, like, word feminism is still like forbidden, or something that if you call yourself some feminist, it's like something which is kind of shameful. So maybe my question is like, how are you also dealing, and what kind of criticism you get when you say you have feminist foreign policy? Like all what you talk about, I have this devil advocate in my head who would be like, well, we actually can call it, as you said, humanity. We can call it peaceful. We can call it, whatever else. But I understand why you call it feminist. But how would you explain that to people, usually men, who would tell you like why you have to call it feminist, why you have to put that label on it, and like whether you are facing this kind of criticism like regularly, and like how to maybe deal with it? Because I would be interested in the research in gender in public policy, like gender mainstreaming and stuff. And this is exactly what I am kind of facing, that how to put the gender lens on it in a way which cannot be criticized so widely as it is.
No, it's spot on. There's like a lot. I wouldn't call it criticism, because criticism should ideally be constructive, but like lots of attacks and vilifications and demonizations because of the word feminism, for feminist foreign policy, but also for me as a person doing feminist work. Hence again, shout out to Hate Aid, who also I work with closely when it comes to online violence. Did I have how many thoughts? 2 thoughts, definitely. First of all, I think that we see societal change always when we also see some rupture somewhere, and people feel like, oh, that is uncomfortable. I think we need some sense of what's the noun of feeling?
Discomfort.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have you next to me. Second time you're helping me out with words. A sense of discomfort for change to happen. So in that sense, I would never shy away from the word feminist, but I would make sure at the same time that I have a good kind of environment and groups around me and other feminists helping when the attacks happen, right? But we need this discomfort for change to happen. And to those who still say, but why call it feminist? It's like putting off so many people. And also in Germany, so often people think it's such an advanced and liberal country. It's a very, very conservative country, and with like huge anti-feminist structures. So, I mean, abortion is not legal in Germany. Everyone's like, really? Yes, really. So it's, I think, then explaining to those people the reason why feminist is putting people off so much. And it's because the feminist movement, 250 years, has been the most successful movement in achieving social change. And especially interesting is the fact that it's overwhelmingly been peaceful, all the change that the feminist movement has created. So those in power, traditionally and until today, they have every right to be afraid of the feminist movement, because the feminists, we were trying to come for their power. All we want is for power shifts to happen, for power to be fairly distributed. So those in power, they're of course worried. But when you are in power, and on top you have the power of narratives and the power of definition, you also have the power to define that feminist is something bad, and that everyone who's a feminist is like, I don't know, all these like stories that are being told about feminists. So it's their interest to continuously talk negatively about feminism. So understanding that, and then if you still have someone, also a lot of women who say, oh, I wouldn't call myself a feminist, then I'm asking them, so would you rather be on the side of those who try to delegitimize social change that has been happening, or would you rather side with those who have done all the work? I mean, the very reason why I was allowed to study at Oxford or study at all, or why in Germany since 1997, only since 1997, women are no longer, it's no longer possible to legally rape women in marriage, or the fact that since only 2016, no means no is a reality in Germany, again, a campaign that we did, some colleagues of mine and I, all of this, the reason why I have a bank account, the reason why I'm allowed to divorce if I get married, all of that, that was feminists fighting for me. So I would rather side with them.
We had a question over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Sophie, also German, and I'm researching EU technology governance. And I'd say long sleeping, but now very much wide awake giant is artificial intelligence at the moment, obviously. And I've been doing some research on AI bias as well. And my question for you would be, like, how big of a threat do you think it is from like the lens of feminist foreign policy, and also what can we even and what should we do about it?
I'm unfortunately no expert at all. The little that I'm touching in the book on the subject is part of, so we, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we've been part of the campaign to stop killer robots, for example, for which AI and the biases, sexist and racist biases, are a big problem when we think about the development of more and more autonomous weapon systems. So that is really all that I've touched on. Yeah. No, everything else that I would say would just me speaking in order to speak, but really not adding much to that, sorry. But important. And adding to that, in Germany, for example, there's now a newly founded organization, one of my mentees, Alex, she started the Center on Feminist AI. So there are people working on it. And we have a couple of partners because we've done some work funded by Microsoft on feminist perspectives on cybersecurity. So there is work being done, but I'm not the best person to talk about it. Thank you.
Go to the gentleman at the back.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, during the apartheid era in South Africa, the international community obviously imposed a great deal of sanctions on the country. There was an arms embargo, they weren't allowed to participate in international sporting events, etc. Are you in favour of similar curbs and embargoes on countries that maintain legal segregation against women, legal discrimination, countries like, for instance, Saudi Arabia as well? Or are you, I mean, essentially I'm asking, what is the extent of what a state should do to further a foreign policy in your mind?
Good question. Give me a second. I want to think about it. If sanctions are an appropriate feminist tool to address discrimination, I mean, so looking, for example, at Afghanistan, there are, I mean, no, it's a fantastic question. It's exactly the questions that we need to ask to get like at the very core of feminist foreign policy. So when it comes to Afghanistan, for example, there were one aspect, kind of this dilemma, and feminist foreign policy or trying to do feminist or foreign policy better, we see dilemmas all the time. And in Afghanistan, you had the dilemma that at least, I mean, there were so many steps that women were barred from public spaces, were no longer allowed to travel by themselves, no longer see a doctor by themselves, no longer to work for international organizations, for NGOs, for the UN, and so forth. There was like this continuous onslaught, and still is, on women's rights. So then there was the question if humanitarian aid should still be given to Afghanistan if women are in a huge part not able to profit from it, or should it be used, kind of the withholding, to pressure the Taliban to give rights back to women? I do not, I mean, I hear, for example, what our steering committee is saying on that, and again, there are debates, there's not one single voice, and there are different arguments for and against. It's about incentivation, something, others would argue it would legitimize. So I do not know the answer. I know it is one of the big dilemmas that is out there. Let me think of. And then also from the perspective of civil society that I am, an activist, civil society author, whatever, it's fairly easy for me to demand something. In all our policy briefs that we write, we have lots of demands what governments should do. But then ultimately it's not my role to implement it, and it's not my role to then discuss and negotiate with countries. So we, for example, also when it comes to the feminist revolution, the feminist revolt in Iran, we, along so many other international feminist or women's rights or human rights organizations, we demanded and still do so to put the revolutionary guard on the EU terror list. It still hasn't happened. That would have had sanctions implications. Some governments would say, but if we do that, we might lose the potential to then have negotiations. For example, also in the case of what we see in the Middle East now, where conversation with Iran might be necessary. So I guess I'm trying to be fair here that the demands that I'm saying, they can be a lot more radical than what policymakers have to deal with. So as an activist in civil society, yes, we have certain demands and still some understanding why it might not ultimately then be the smartest way. I think, again, dilemmata, yeah.
Tough questions. Let's go to the back here, former MPP student.
Hello, my name is Shamarke. I'm 2022 MPP last year, and it's great to be back. I do have a question, and I got your book. I look forward to reading it and your signature. Elections happen and new governments come in liberal democracy. Last year in Sweden, new government abandoned the feminist foreign policy. So in your opinion, what do you think are potential implications or already had or in the future that this could shift for gender equality initiatives globally and future foreign feminist policy?
September last year, after the elections in Sweden, literally one of the first things the new government did was to cancel the Feminist Foreign Policy, delete the website with all the information about Feminist Foreign Policy, and it's something that is shocking but not surprising, because it's always one of the first things that those who are further to the right would do, like attacking women's rights and anything that is feminist and open and liberal and progressive and all of that. So it was a big setback, especially for civil society around the world, because civil society until that point, we and many others really could, to some extent, count on Sweden to be an ally on women's rights, on LGBTQI rights, on human rights in general. So that was gone. And despite the Swedish government since having over and over argued that nothing would change of substance, what we have seen, especially when it comes to redirecting funds, for example, from SIDA, that is the Swedish International Aid Agency, funds have been directed away from women's LGBTQI rights. So Sweden is definitely no longer the ally that it used to be. And also, to be honest, in Germany, we have elections again in 2 years. And Germany has officially a feminist foreign policy, and really great work has been happening. Of course, not perfect, and like so much for us like to criticize, but also a lot of great work. And I feel like in 2 years' time it might be over with the German feminist foreign policy, because as it stands now, we would not have the same government again, but a conservative, at least to some extent, conservative government. So the question is, and many of the government representatives, but also government staff working for foreign ministries with a feminist foreign policy, they are, together with us as civil society, we're asking exactly that question: what can be done to better institutionalize feminist foreign policy and kind of protect it from changes after election. And in Germany, in the process of the creation of the guidelines on Germany's feminist foreign policy last year, which we were part of, we kept saying, please, we need some institution, some board, some advisory groups, something consisting of civil society and academia and government representatives, and ideally some really with high reputation and well-known, because not only because they would ideally continuously inform the German government on their work, but also the more new institutions you form, the new structures you build, the more difficult it is to destroy them again. They did not do it, unfortunately. I know that other governments, they're thinking about putting it into their constitutions. Of course, there's again a lot to be said about constitutions with have lots of detail, but these are different ideas that people are playing with to kind of protect feminist foreign policies.
Okay, so we have, we have 7 minutes or so, and I see a number of hands. So what I suggest is that we take a couple of questions, and then we take a one last go. So first question here.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Victoria Divars. I'm a defense student here in international relations. I've been following the work of the center for some time, so I was very happy to be here. And you touched upon it a little bit during the talk. I feel like when we talk about feminism, a lot of people understand gender instead of it means much more than this, rights of LGBTQ plus community, but also anti-racism. And I was just wondering how you were engaging, especially on questions related to racism and colonial legacies with government. And did you feel that there was more resistance to change in that regard rather than gender questions?
Okay, great. That's question one. There was a question back here somewhere. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tamler. I'm on the MPP this year. And I think my question is kind of linked to the last question here about apartheid sanctions. On one hand, are you thinking about this more as a framework for more developed or Western countries? Because I feel like once there's the word feminist in any sort of political ideologies, in some ears, it just immediately shuts down that conversation. And I hear, if I'm understanding what you're saying, is that the concept of feminism as it is presented here and the traditions that you're trying to honor with this in the foreign policy perspective is that it's much more than, as you were saying, the gender and more about sweeping or an instrument for social change as it has been over the last 250 years, right? But are there trade-offs that we would have to make in terms of maintaining the phrase, if it kind of closes some doors of conversations? And also, is the work then more about educating everyone about feminism is not just about the gender, or it's more about the kind of broad ideal for what we want society to look like, and how that would apply outside of, I guess, more developed or more Western countries? Because I feel recently I've had a few conversations about this topic where some of the smartest men I know just shut down this thing because there's this, there's the culture wars and everything on social media is just it's ridiculous. So how do you kind of, because there's some level of feeling excluded automatically by the word feminism that I feel like I've been getting that kind of sense from a lot of my male counterparts. So it's an interesting one from the way I'm thinking about it and how it applies to the work that you're doing.
Oh my gosh. It also just, I'm going to take these two hands and then we'll come, but I also just say there's an online question about how you think about countries in Asia and whether you can apply these frameworks. So it's a very similar, I think, set of concerns. And then let me take these two questions. I'll start with you.
Thank you so much. And at the time when I was studying modern theology at graduate level, and I was working quite a bit on European diplomacy and the way religion plays a role. So in the democratic peace-building tradition, there's way more about grassroots, empowering women, also religious communities. But then there's a whole different strand of very conservative approach to religion and having that freedom of religion, anti-abortion kind of thing also in the name of religion. And one side would say, well, we give the voice to grassroots with a very progressive agenda in the background. And another side would say we're doing religious inspired foreign policy or religious peace-building policy with a very conservative agenda. So it seems from what you're saying that there is a political agenda as well, which is pretty assumed, but you're also having a difficulty with then Sweden not being an ally anymore. So to what extent should feminist foreign policy be a method rather than a substantial claim for what we want to achieve in political terms, to have it more long-term, maybe give space to some women feminists do not agree at all from first world, majority, minority world, on what the role of women is about. Is it rather about giving women who disagree on things space to speak, or is it implementing a more essentialist version of how society should look like?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Big questions. And then last, you can just...
I'll try to go quickly. I'm just curious about uptake of your report of your Feminist Foreign Policy Manifesto for Germany. I know we spoke a little bit about the concerns about institutionalization of feminist foreign policy, but just given the current circumstances, how is your team pushing for uptake? How has it been received already by the German government, given that I was specifically very interested in the migration and asylum section, and you're calling for quite radical decolonial reforms, which are fantastic, but how are those received? And was there any pushback, and how are you kind of pushing it?
That was a big range of questions, and you may not be able to obviously answer them all in 3 minutes, but over to you.
I'll try. Thank you. So with regards to, I think I can connect those three a little bit, and then maybe on the reactions. I'll start with you, and I feel like I saw like two themes I would like to respond to. One of them, if someone who works on feminist foreign policy is alienating men, the male counterparts at your program, for example. So the way I'm dealing with that is with stating facts, right? So the second you tell someone, for example, if we only focus on gender, and true, gender is only one aspect of feminism and the attempt to change power structures. So if we, for example, look at gender and we have the facts of that women globally only enjoy 3/4 of the rights that men enjoy, that every day in Germany and other countries, maybe more or less, a man tries to kill his partner, female partner, ex-partner. The fact that around 15 white men in the world own as much wealth as all women on the African continent together. The fact that there are very many countries in the world where abortion is not only legal, but even miscarriages can bring you to prison. Like, if you have all these facts about like grave injustices in the world, and if you tell someone that and you say, listen, I think that's not cool, so I want to work on that, and because my work is in the tradition of the feminist movement, I would call it that way, and this person, this guy, I don't know, still feels alienated, then I would always put the onus of explanation onto him, and I would ask, why would you accept living in a world like this and have no interest in trying to change that? And with regards, I felt there was a second question about if feminism or feminist foreign policy, if it's a Western concept, and what to respond to those who say that. I have a couple of ideas on that, and one is that a few years back, I asked exactly that question to one of our advisory council members, Rosebel Kagomira. She's a well-known African feminist working in the space of policymaking and also feminist foreign policy. And when I said that to her, that so many people would say that, kind of in line with this notion of, or accusation, I don't know, of human rights being a Western concept, she said that everyone who would argue so completely dismisses the rich history of African feminism, which has strong links to the decolonial movement. So there are, like, in all countries, there's this rich feminist history, and just as many people are trying to say that it's not a part of someone's culture. So she she was really outspoken against that. And then again, we have the facts. We have the fact that it was 2 Latin American women who made sure that the equality between men and women was part of the UN Charter in the late 40s. It was Berta Luz from Dominican Republic, Brazil. Thank you. One lady, Brazil, and the other one, Dominican Republic. Thank you. Mix it up. We can read it in Women at the UN, a great book. Thank you. And the fact that in the 70s and 80s, when this important women's rights and feminist agenda developed at the UN, it was mainly women from the so-called Global South who we owe that to. So feminism, feminist foreign policy are by no means Western concepts, and more initiatives, global initiatives, kind of develop and come up that are working on the subject from different regions of the world. In Latin America, we have PFAL now. That's a new platform on feminist foreign policy in Latin America, civil society coordinated. On the African continent, Rose Kagumira and Tony Hastrup, a great feminist academic based in the UK as well, they've initiated the Feminist Informed Foreign Policy Collective. So we have all of that. These were maybe thoughts on that. And then on operationalizing a decolonized approach, maybe especially for a country that is global north based. So we at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we have 6 program areas. Disarmament, climate justice, defending women's and LGBTQI rights, and also one is anti-racism and decolonized foreign policy. So the project team, the colleagues working on that, for example, they're currently running a project funded by the Open Society. Sorry, that's such a NGO thing explaining who is funding it. Sorry, it's really not important, but the project they're currently running on decolonizing foreign policy, and they put together a steering committee with the leading practitioners and activists and academics on the subject from around the world to look at different countries' foreign policies and suggest exactly what a decolonized foreign approach would look like. In the manifesto that you mentioned, our Feminist Foreign Policy Manifesto for Germany, which we published in September 2021 before the last German elections, we included a sub-chapter on decolonizing German foreign policy as well. And then, depending on the country context, that would include, of course, for example, I don't know, giving back Benin statues. It includes reparations. It includes acknowledging German genocides. It includes structural changes in the Foreign Office. These are some examples. And I feel like I wanted to respond to this question here as well briefly. Essentialist. I had a thought on that. 1 second. Is it essentialist? Is it... I think I wanted to say that
I guess I was hinting at the same problematics of third, fourth wave of feminism, decolonial theory actually being highly critical of us sitting here in Oxford, having this talk about feminist foreign policy, there being no agreement whatsoever on what feminist is. So
right.
Kind of, an agenda for...
And also the dispute.
Yeah, exactly. So what
thank you.
In the long term.
And you know the feminist movement and those trying to do feminist work, of course, they're also not homogeneous, right? So there's lots of dispute and arguments within the feminist movement, and then again within those working on feminist foreign policy. And whenever it's constructive, it's very healthy, because this is the way you develop ideas and thoughts and policies. There are different understandings of feminism, especially when you look at certain subjects. Be it women in the military, for example, is a very concrete one. Some would argue that feminism in the military would mean that we have just as many women, for example, making military decisions in the military sector, and others, including myself, would argue that I think that in a truly feminist world, we would not focus on militarized security, but we would somehow work towards transforming militarized structures into other structures that have the potential to foster human security. So there's lots of debate about that, and there's debate, I don't know, on sex work and how to legalize that, and there's debate on different topics, and that's totally fine. Yeah.
Good. Well, listen, that many more conversations to be had, and we hope that in a couple of years we can have you back to talk about the progress in advancing feminist foreign policy. But before we all leave, can you please join me in thanking Kristina for sharing her book?